Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Russia's hybrid warfare tactics, including spanning cyberattacks, disinformation, and infrastructure sabotage, have put Western nations under constant pressure. In this context, Finland has stood out for its proactive and effective approach to national security. Recent incidents in the Baltic Sea, such as damage to critical power cables and suspected shadow fleet activity, further underscores the region's growing vulnerabilities. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss these pressing challenges is Lieutenant General Arto Räty, former Permanent Secretary of the Finnish Ministry of Defense. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you. Good evening.
So, first, can you help us understand how should Baltic Sea nations be responding to Russian provocations like the recent damage to the critical infrastructure?
I would like to start by saying that there are three kind of threats we are facing at the moment on the Baltic Sea region. And first one of them is environmental catastrophe, which is a very serious risk since we have oil tankers in bad condition sailing in the Baltic Sea at the moment. That's mostly about the Russian shadow fleet ships. Second one is the threat against our gas pipes, our electricity lines, and our data lines, cables under the subsea area, which we have seen happening lately. And the third one is, of course, a possibility of escalation. If Russia begins to somehow secure their shadow fleet with military capabilities, there's always an escalation risk existing. What the Baltic nations should actually do now is, in my thinking, number one is to create a good situational awareness of those risks and threats we have, analyze them, and then decide how should we prepare ourselves to prevent these issues or how to defend ourselves. Secondly, we should create a high readiness, and I don't mean only in military ways, but also in our different authorities like border guard, customs, police, military, and of course legally we have to be prepared to understand what kind of legal frameworks we have in which we have to act in the Baltic Sea region. And the third one is to have a tool set in our hands. This means that we have to have capabilities in our authorities in their hands that they can react immediately if things go badly. And this includes, in my thinking, the legal framework I already mentioned. It includes the cooperation between the Baltic Sea countries, and it especially includes NATO and NATO's preparedness in the area.
Right, and speaking of NATO preparedness, what role can NATO play in deterring these sort of threats in the Baltic region?
I think the NATO's main role, of course, is to defend and support its allies in the Baltic Sea region. And of course, it needs to show very clearly the commitment of NATO. NATO is ready, willing to act if the need comes. And I think what NATO should do is to show force, as it's been doing at the moment. And this is the way to prevent issues to happen. Of course, the area is a new area in many ways for most of the countries, and defending our lines in subsea area is very complicated issue. And that's why those capabilities have to be created in NATO nations and also as NATO as an organization.
Right, we seem to have a little bit of connection issue here. Do you think Finland should consider hosting a permanent NATO presence to enhance the regional security?
When Finland joined NATO, we clearly said that we don't have any restrictions when it comes to NATO membership. We want to be open and see and act according to situation. We have today a big number of exercises executed in the region, and especially in Finland at the moment, that those exercises happen in maritime, air and land and joint area, which means that the presence is executed at the moment by exercising the area, which in my thinking is the best way to do it. I think this should be continued. That's one of the issues, to have exercise and so that we are ready to act if need comes. Of course, there will be a question of NATO deployment to Finnish territory. That's an area I think it's better for me not to take any kind of stand, because it's an area where the decision has to come from NATO and Finland, and they have to consider these issues together.
Right. And turning your attention to our side of the world, how do you assess Poland's proposal to establish a naval policing mission in the Baltic Sea?
I think that proposal made by Tusk was a very justified proposal in today's situation, and definitely it's a proposal which we should take very seriously, because Baltic Sea region, even though it's a small area when it comes to sea territory, it's still large enough that ships can disappear and we can't find them all. So we need some capabilities which are combined between different Baltic Sea nations. And I think it's a very good proposal. We should take it very seriously. But in my thinking, it should happen under NATO umbrella and be one of the NATO actions in the region.
And speaking of that, do you see any potential for northeastern NATO members to form some sort of cooperative security bloc aimed at deterring Russian aggression?
I have to underline that there is excellent cooperation existing already today. And this cooperation has been deepening day by day. And of course, when Finland and Sweden joined NATO, they took this cooperation to much higher level than it used to be. It already existed before NATO membership, but now it's on a much higher level. Yes, we need to enhance always our cooperation. That's one of the basic issues of defense. But even in this case, I would be somewhat skeptical of creating some kind of a bloc of Baltic Sea nations inside NATO, because when you establish blocks or groups inside the alliance, usually it divides the alliance into different boxes, which is not good. We should have a look at NATO as a whole and try to have this as a NATO mission, not as a couple of nations mission. But what I said about the cooperation, yes, enhancement is definitely always needed, even though we have it already existing.
All right, thank you for that. And a lot of people, experts that we've been asking, have been saying that the Finns are doing it right regarding to this action taken against the Russian aggression. What lessons can other nations learn from Finland's approach when it comes to countering these hybrid threats?
I think this comes from our history, and we have executed this kind of total security and total defense concepts since 1960s. We have educated our politicians, our business leaders, universities, every single sector of society, industry included, and to understand what means total security in the society, how should we prepare ourselves. And I think this action, the latest action, is a good proof of that kind of cooperation, how it works, because this was definitely a show of good cooperation between the customs, the police, the Coast Guard, and the Navy. And I mean, these kind of actions in many countries, authorities are in their own boxes. In Finland, we try to work hand in hand, and we have our preparedness and our readiness. We have built our preparedness and readiness together with all different stakeholders. And this kind of total approach for defense and security is one thing that should be taken very seriously nowadays.
Right, I think preparedness is indeed the key here. Even since before joining NATO, the interoperability within the bloc is already very strong, as we can observe. One of the interesting things that I also want to explore is perhaps whether or not this pipeline or these cables being severed is also showcasing some sort of vulnerability when it comes to these infrastructure. And do you think there are any other aspects that we need to start thinking about strengthening now to prevent these sort of sabotage from happening again?
Yeah, after working 6 years in the energy sector after my military career, I learned one thing about the electricity cables and lines and connections. And the best thing we can do nowadays is to make sure that we are not depending on individual connections and lines. We have to have a network, and we need to have different kind of options for our data transfer, for our energy transfer, and not depending on one line. And this is something Finland has been doing since the beginning. We have established a very good electricity network in Finland, and same comes with the data cables. However, as I said earlier, defending subsea region is a new territory in a way for all the countries, and that is something we need to carefully study, and how can we, in the best way, secure our lines. And we need to have more connections between our countries to be sure that we are not depending on individual lines. Now, when we had this latest incident in Finland, it doesn't affect our business life or our daily life in Finland at all. It may slow down in some cases the connections, but we have several other options existing. But of course, it's a risky area, and we need to do more actions to secure those lines.
Right. And last but not least, what step do you think these regional powers can take to ensure at least a swift recovery and resilience after hybrid attacks such as these ones?
I'm sorry, I missed your question because there was a bad connection. Can you say it again?
What steps do you think that regional powers can take to ensure swift recovery or resilience after these hybrid attacks?
No, I would say the first thing what I have learned during my career is education and training and awareness. People need to be aware of these risks and threats, and actions to be taken if there are any attacks against you. And surprises are always bad, and we should be aware that this kind of surprise can only be avoided by training and education. And the second one is the cooperation. You actually mentioned a couple of times in your questions already. That is a key element here. Cooperation inside the society between different stakeholders. This kind of total approach creates resilience.
Right. Thank you so much for your input.
I think in Finland we have one thing that has been left from the past, which I'm very proud of, and that's conscription, which makes sure that every family has a connection to national defense and security through their youngsters who make their conscription, and maybe after, of course, later when they are reservists in the armed forces. That's one of the issues that has really strengthened the Finnish awareness and resilience.
Hey, thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us at TVP World.
Thank you.
Cheers. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.